Oh, welcome back. This is Lusterquin. Today I'm going to show you Amorphous Sounds. Specifically, I want to look at a few of the techniques that I used to create this project. The inspiration for this piece originated from a more experimental and you could say psychedelic point of view. I was very interested in the concept of IDM, or intelligent dance music, at the time that I created this, and even though this track does not exactly exhibit any characteristics of IDM music, it very much works in that direction. And considering that's closer to the type of music I want to start moving into this year, I wanted to take some time to think about some of the techniques that I use to morph different sounds or the parameters that I play with throughout this track that make it sound more complex than it really is. And that is very much the key. A lot of the sounds in this track are actually just one sound. They're just morphed in a lot of different ways. This track was created last August 2018, and I created it over the span of just a few days, which is unheard of for me. I usually take much longer than that to compose music. I mean, The Grim of War took me almost 4 years. So to make a whole track in a few days is definitely telling of how inspired or how motivated I was with this concept. And it all started with this melody. I'm going to play this melody for you. A basic melody, it doesn't have a whole lot going on until you start morphing it. So, take a look at this playlist over here to my right. The sound that I'm using is a buzzsaw. It's a sound that I created, but it's a very simple sound. And what we do is we pick a few select parameters that can radically change the way that it sounds. And so these parameters are right here in the playlist over here to my right. These parameters change throughout different parts of the track that make this buzzsaw sound very different. So for example, we've got the pluck delay or pluck decay length here changing a bit. That is what makes it sound like a pluck right now. It acts as a pluck, but if we were to bring this to 100%, it'd be a very much bolder sound. And we also got pitch vibrato depth, unison order, two of these for A and B, since you've got two different sources here. We've got the pluck decay length also for the B part. We have the volume, band frequency, that's coming from the parametric EQ in here. This, by automating this, this, gives it kind of some phasing effects here. That's why we sort of move the sixth band around the spectrum quite a bit there, and we cut certain parts of the spectrum around. That's how you create phasing effects. And then we've also got the reverb that we're playing with as well. And at some point, it looks like it's not in this part of the playlist, but we're also modifying the prism parameter, which is a really interesting parameter. So what we're going to do first is I want to play through some parts just highlighting this sound. So I'm going to mute all the others. And we're going to just sort of cut through so you can hear how the alterations of these parameters affect the sound. So we'll start off, and as this first section goes through, it sounds very much like a pluck. And here we start to introduce some nuances to the sound. If we cut here. Okay, and here you'll notice the reverb is much less. We bring the wet volume down for that. So you can see here that we're sort of slowly starting to introduce changes in the sound's behavior. And this comes to light right at this second section here. You could say the build-up. CPU is going a little crazy there, but notice how we transform the sound into a pluck type of melody, and then we turn it into something a little bit more like this, something more chord-based, right? More of a pad-like sequence. And that's what we have going on here in this second section. And then later, we do some more interesting things. Take a look at this section of the playlist. This is the same pattern. Looks a little different. I think it's a different variation of the pattern. Yeah, so this is a different variation of the pattern. But we are looking at some different parameters here. Some of the same ones, but focus on... Oh, I'm looking for some specific parameters here. I want you to focus on the pitch vibrato depth, this one, and then also focus, or these two, the pitch vibrato depth, and then also focus on the unison order, because both of these play some significant roles in how they impact the sound texture. And texture is a huge part of how your ears can perceive differences in sound. You can hear very thin sounds, very thick sounds, and it can be the very same sound, but because there is such a disparity in the texture of the two, they can sound very different. And that's the type of I guess, audible illusion that we create in this track. And so as you listen to this section, again, it's the same sound, but it turns into several different sounds. So you can hopefully see what I mean about having that sort of psychedelic influence. There is a lot of, you could say, a modulation and a lot of morphing going on there. That has to do with this envelope here, the prism amount. If we remove that prism, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that does in a minute. Just trying to see, I think there should be another prism envelope in here somewhere, possibly. There's a time blur decay as well. I've also got the phaser width. There's just a whole bunch of things going on, but it's the prism that I'm really interested in. I may have them both routed to that. So let's now listen to that same section without the prism taking effect. So you still get a lot of those changes in texture in fullness, but you do not get the full impact of the sort of modular side of things. So let's take a look now at the prism. Prism is really interesting. What it does is, from my understanding, I don't really know all of the technical description of what this parameter does, but I know what I know it acts like a prism, right? It takes frequencies and it bounces them around a bit like a prism. Like if you think about light and how light enters a prism and it's refracted, right? It's distorted a bit. It's kind of the same way here. The frequencies that are going into the prism are bounced or refracted around a bit. And you have two modes that you can select from. You can have an add mode, or you can have multiply. I do multiply because I think it sounds a lot more radical that way. And what we're going to do is take a look here. If you go to your articulation editor, you have you can select, if you go to shaping, and this is what the harmonic prism looks like. Again, I do not really know what this means. And you can see here in B, a lot of what I have done in this track is very audible. In other words, when I am playing with things like prism, and when I am playing with a lot of the effects that you hear in this section, I am not doing so with an understanding, a textual understanding of what is going on, right? When we create experimental music, we're not always necessarily taking from book knowledge, right? I do not know what the prism does. I just know how it sounds. And I know that how it sounds aligns with what I want for this track, for this particular section. I was playing around with it and I said, that sounds really cool. And that's pretty much the basis for everything in this track. And that's an important thing to note. See, I think a lot of the time, producers, at least that I have talked to, have succumbed to the misunderstanding that in order to create technically complex sounding music, such as this section here, you have to know what you're doing, right? The reality is you don't. You just have to know how to think creatively about what you're doing. And some of the ways that we do that, and some of the ways that I leverage that in this track, is by focusing on choice parameters that have radical impacts on the sound. And then I think about how I can transition those in the most interesting ways. That's why I've chosen the specific automation clips that I have here. And you can see that there are some specific relationships that I have created. When the unison is increased, I also have the pitch vibrato depth increased. You can see here. Those work together to bolster the fullness of that section of the sound. Additionally, I have the pluck decay length increased at that same interval, at that same bar section. And likewise, when I have the unison at 0, the pitch vibrato depth and the pluck decay length are also at 0. Not on all accounts. Obviously, we have a section here where the pitch vibrato depth is at 100 and the unison is at 0. But then we bring it down to 0. And we create a lot of variations in the sound with these varying relationships. And that is another very important thing to look at here, is the relationships between the individual parameters, right? It's not just enough to take one parameter and move it up and down in a random fashion, right? Do not confuse creativity with randomness. Now, granted, sometimes the most creative sounds can spur from randomness, and I am not at all trying to detract from this idea that sometimes it's okay to be a little random. But you also have to be able to pick up on the relationships that your sounds have with each other, right? Because that's the difference, I think, between knowing what you're doing and just doing. Right? So for example, I could just take, if we go back to this prism section, and we look at the prism amount here, I could have just very easily created a very random envelope here and just kind of move some things around. But that doesn't exactly create a coherent piece of music, right? It doesn't exactly create something that bolsters what I was going for, which was one sound that can turn into many sounds. And so that's why I highlight the importance of thinking about how your parameters and how your sounds, therefore, since the parameters in this case define the sound, how they work together to create coherency. And so, again, a lot of this has to do with experimentation, and that's the key with this type of psychedelic sort of music, is you are experimenting and you're playing around with it, but it's trial and error. You're figuring out what works, and you're figuring out what does not. And so that's what this was a result of, is figuring out what works. So with all of that rambling sort of done, I hope that that made a little bit of sense. I do want to look at a couple other things in this track, because that's just one sound. Every single sound is actually amorphous. Think about the percussion, for example. I'm going to try to find it here, because I don't really know where it is. I haven't looked at this track in a little bit of a while now. I think this section here, oh, it's muted. I forget. Okay. Yes. So even the drums are actually amorphous. So when they start, and I'm trying to think, 10, 8, I want to mute these, and in fact I might just be able to mute the individual sounds, because I want to highlight how the drums sort of change throughout this track as well. Because there's a very specific technique that I use for drums, and that is reduction. I use a plugin called D-Blue Crusher, which is really cool. Let's see what this does. Yeah. So there are two drum sequences here. There's that one. There's also this thing here. You can see there was another sort of variation there. Oh, a little bit of a lag spike there. So focus here. Notice I've sort of stopped the playlist at this section. Fruity Squeeze is an interesting plugin, really interesting. I do not necessarily endorse its bit crushing quality as much as I would, for example, D-Blue Crusher, but Fruity Squeeze can do some very interesting things, and as we listen to here. So I've got a lot of stuff on this section here. I've got a parametric EQ, I've got a Vocodex, which goes in and out. And again, this is how I sort of separate between the two sounds. And I want to try and find a section here. Notice how as I sort of slide through this, in this first part of the track, there is no Fruity Squeeze, no Wave Shaper, no Vocodex, no Blood Overdrive, no Transient Processor, right? It sounds like this. Basic drums. And then we introduce the effects to turn the drums into something more. Vocodex acts as a bit of a noise gate here, and it also adds some interesting effects. Again, I don't really know what I was doing when I created this. I basically went through this and I just created some stuff, and I kept modifying these envelopes until it reached a point that I was happy with, and I said, okay, well, I guess that's how it's going to sound. So what I therefore did was I modulated, or I automated when the Vocodex would come in so that I could pan back and forth between when the Vocodex is active and when it's not. So think about this section here. I turn the drums into something else. At bar 18, I want you to pay attention to the fact that the Vocodex completely cuts out and we immediately introduce Wave Shaper and Fruity Squeeze. And think about how different this drum section sounds. It is less filtered now and more distorted, which I guess you could say is a type of filtering, considering that we are using the filter in Fruity Squeeze, that is. Fruity Squeeze, again, it's not a great bit crusher, I don't think. That's why I like D-Blue Crusher a little bit more. It's more direct, more to the point. Squeeze is a little bit more selective, I think, in the types of effects that it can do. It certainly is great for creating sort of filtered grit sounds, I think. If you're looking like this Square Eyes, for example, is really interesting. Here I automate the resonance and something else. I think it's the cutoff, it sounds like. Yeah, so here I'm really just using the filter and you can even see it here. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like if the filter was all the way at the top. It's kind of like a distorted noise gate a little bit, even though it doesn't really cut the noise because we've also got this reverb on the end here. But it does have some interesting effects, and I think it goes very well with Wave Shaper because I use Wave Shaper here just to give the sound a little more presence. And then Blood Overdrive, which is not active at this part. Oh, in the next section. So at bar 34, we cut Squeeze and Wave Shaper to introduce Blood Overdrive in the processor. So here's what that sounds like. All right, we're going to try that again and mute all these other sounds. Okay. All right, and we're going to talk about this mess, this colorful mess in a minute here. Okay. All right, I think that is all of them. Let's see if we have any more surprises waiting for us. Much cleaner it sounds. It sounds much cleaner. Now, there is a little bit of distortion. You did hear a little bit there, and that is because of the overdrive. I have this all the way up, and I have a little bit of preamp going on there. But the reason we need it much cleaner is because, as you heard unsuspectingly, that's when we introduce this heavy bass. And so we need to, again, it's all about the balance. It's all about the relationships between your sounds. The bass is very heavy, and it's very, very grimy, I guess you could say. This is not a word I use in my everyday jargon. That's why I had some difficulty finding it. But grimy, I think, is a good descriptor for this bass. And so to balance that, we need a cleaner percussive section. That's why we clean it up a little bit. We get rid of that squeeze for that section, then we bring in the overdrive in the transient processor. So that's a little bit of how the drums are set up. Let's talk about this bass now. This bass, which is introduced here, is one, I don't even remember when I made this. It is, where is it? Ketchup. This is a Patcher. Oh, this is a Seamless inspired bass. Yes, that is what is happening here. So I don't remember which Seamless created a video. It was one of his how-to bass videos, and I thought it was really cool what he did with how he used modulation to create different texture in the bass, and that's what all of these envelopes are. Notice how these are all volume envelopes for each of the individual operators, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then again 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for both of these citruses in here. That's what all these red dots are. And then I also am automating phaser, filter, bandwidth of the Vocodex that is in here. I don't remember the how to bass video, unfortunately, but I went ahead and recreated the bass in here. And it's a very interesting behavior that happens. So basically, and in case you're wondering, again, when I created all of these automation clips, nothing in here was really calculated. I basically just moved the points around until it made some sense to me and it sounded cool. So each of these citruses, you'll notice there's an interesting behavior with this modulation matrix where every operator is modulating other operators, right? So there's just a little bit. I don't go too heavy on the modulation. It's just a little bit with each one, and this adds a little bit more. And this allows us to play with the, I'm trying to find here where the, it's this volume envelope is the equivalent of these frequency modulation knobs over here. This volume knob is the equivalent to that. So that's what we're automating in here. It's the amount of modulation that occurs here. That's why we only bring in a little bit so that we can have some more freedom with how much we are doing over here. And what this really does is it just gives the sound a little bit more character. And that's what we're looking for, is a very dynamic, very moving bass. That's how we create it, is we create some very complex modulation. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it doesn't have to. That's why it's so dynamic. It doesn't make sense. And if we look at these sounds, it's very simple sound. Just a couple of variations of sine waves here, really. And then, well, here we have a little bit triangle wave and such, and here's a saw. So triangle, saw, and then we've got some sine variations in here. But that's it. And then we just modulate everything. And with this citrus, it's pretty much the same thing. Actually, I think it's the exact same thing. And then on that one, we've got a wave shaper there. The difference is one of them is acting as a carrier, and one of them is acting as a modulator inside the Vocodex. And inside the Vocodex, we are automating the bandwidth as well. And the bandwidth is an interesting parameter because it earlier we talked a little bit about texture, and between really thin sounds and really thick sounds, bandwidth is basically that parameter. If you have it on 0, the bands are super thin, and so as a result, the vocoded signal, the output of that is super thin. Whereas if you bring it to 100, the bands are so thick they're almost overlapping each other. So it's a very thick sound as a result. And so that's why we automate that, to move that around a bit. Then we of course got that going into a big old Maximus here, which is pressed to the extreme here. It's crushed to hell, basically. And then we've got a final EQ here to cut out that low end, because down here we've got a sub. This is the sort of sub bass that rests underneath, and you can see here I have something. This sort of cuts out the high end here a bit, because we don't need it, because we have the high end from this, the main bass in here. And then everything goes to a limiter just to bring things back, to level it back down a bit, and then it goes out. So that's how that bass works. And again, that is a seamless bass. I don't know if I changed anything when I recreated it here, but it's pretty much, and the idea with these modulation parameters and modifying these, that is something that I found in one of Seamless's how-tos, and I thought it was really cool. And it fits within this track's sort of goal. Okay, so in that I use a few different times, and I will play it for you. I don't know why I didn't do that, but I definitely want you to hear it. So let's play all of that real quick so you can listen to it. Yeah, so you can hear a very, very colorful sound, which matches the aesthetics that you are looking at here. I used this a couple more times. I use it again here at the end. I think I just copy-pasted the same set of envelopes here. I don't know where it went. But anyway, there's a couple other sounds I want to touch on. We are kind of running out of time here. I don't want this video to be super long. But I want to show you a couple more interesting things in this track. First, morphine. How could I create a track with a morph sounds without ImageLine's morphine? Now, I've not seen a whole lot of information about morphine. I don't know that it is a very popular plugin, but I find it to be very interesting. And there's a lot that I have found with this plugin that can be very cool. And I try to exploit that with this track, so I'm going to try and find some sections here where I can show it to you. So I'm going to look at this section morph and see if I can find some sections here that use the sound. Here we go. And then so some of you might say, well, that sounds really weird, and I would say, yes, it does. Throughout these sections, this is a supporting sound throughout the track. In the beginning, and it is the same sound, but the differences lie in the morph matrix here. I want to talk about this for just a minute. This is the same sound, all three of these. The reason that I have different channels here to do it is because there's not a way, at least that I know of, that you can automate this. And this is what I was wanting to automate, is so that I could have a way to dynamically move around the relationship between these four generators. And so what I'm going to do actually is show you now in this video what that looks like in real time and what I attempted to do in this track. And I'm going to do so by playing this. And as I play this, listen to how different it sounds as I move these parameters around. And so you may not know what you're looking at. So I'll try to explain this best I can. Basically, think of this morph path section here as an envelope, because it is one. And it starts it starts here at generator A. And then it moves over to generator B, 100%, moves from A to B, and then it adds generator D, right? But it's just a little bit. It's not a lot. That's why you can see here it's at 0. And then if I were to move this over here, you can see we would have generator A, B, C, and D all at like 100%. So this is going to make more sense once we start to play it here, because you can't really, it's hard to visualize because you're looking at like 3 different visuals. But what it is it's a grid where each corner, each quadrant is a different generator. And so, for example, if we moved everything to the middle, right, if we did this, it would sound like this. Not very good, right? But now, let's delete these and just start with generator A. This is just what A sounds like, the A sound. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Now we move on over here to generator B. Here's what B sounds like. A little bit better. And then we move down to C. Here's what C sounds like. Notice, by the way, that these are all like out of tune on purpose. Here's generator D. Okay, so let's start with B, because I think B sounds the best. Now, if I take one of these and I add generator C just a bit, and I'm going to move this around while it's playing, because I want you to be able to follow exactly what's happening. So, I'm going to play this, and I'm going to move this dot around. I'm going to start at generator C, and then I'm going to move it over to generator D. Then I'm going to move it up to generator A, and then I'm going to move it back. Okay? So just focus on, now that you know what all 4 of those sound like, focus on how they impact each other. So, if you did not understand any of that, good, because that's exactly the point. Everything that I did in here was a result of just effing around with it. So like this one, for example, and actually I'm just going to cut and paste this in here so you can see this is just a different combination. Okay, and then there is also this one. Very clean, but out of tune. Yeah. Okay, so basically the consensus here is that by using variations of this sort of combination that are rather out of tune or otherwise a little bit offset from the original sound, we can create some very interesting illusions, audible illusions here, where by piling this on top of the main sound, which in this case is the buzzsaw. So if I go ahead and do this, okay, listen to how the sort of detuning of this complements the main pluck here. Oh, hang on. You know what? I just realized that this is completely wrong. I think I'm going to try and get this back to how I had it. I think it sounded like that. I think. I hope that's right. Yep. That is it. Okay, so let's listen to this now. Notice how we started completely silent, and we slowly bring it in. This is to give the illusion that our pluck is morphing into this. That's the illusion here. So here we use volume to give off the facade that this buzzsaw is morphing into this morph sound, this morph sort of pluck that we just looked at here. And what we do is we increase the volume of that while decreasing the volume of the buzzsaw. And so we create this sort of seamless transition between the two sounds. Later on in the track, we have a separate section, I think. Here we go, right here. Okay, so let's look at this a bit. Okay, so this is kind of mimicking kind of like a harpsichord thing. That's what this variation of the sound is. And it's layered on top of this thing, this little keyboard thing there. And then we also have this, which actually, I'm going to play this section fully so you can listen to it. It's faint, but you'll notice that you can hear this section very clearly in the beginning, and then it just drops, and we sort of highlight this harpsichord sound a little bit more. So you can hear the kind of round transitions here, and the reason why is because this is in mono, so whenever this note plays, it almost slides to it. And then you don't hear it again. And again, this is a technique that I use quite deliberately throughout this track where I am just cutting between sounds to make it seem as though sounds are transitioning into one another, even if they're really not. And we see this again with the bass section here in this segment. There is a segment here, I think, that uses 100 bass sounds. I don't know where it is. Yeah. I am trying to find it. Here we have some guitar mutes. Okay. And then we have I'm trying to find, all right, here, this might be a better way to do it. So we've got a couple bass sounds here. Yeah, okay, here we go. So here's what I'm talking about here with these bass sounds. So in one of these sections here, you can hear that in reality, it sounds like it's one bass, or maybe a couple basses, but there's a lot of sort of seamless transitioning going on there. And that has to do with how we move from sound to sound, and we don't really give much space. Like, in a lot of sounds, what I will do is create, I'll do like this, right? I'll give a little bit of space in between so that you can clearly differentiate the sounds. So like in complextro music, for example, I like to make the cuts very sharp, right? We like to make sharp contrasts where we introduce one sound and then we cut and then we introduce another sound, and it's very, very sharp, the contrasts are. Here, it is not. Here, I want it to sound like one sound. I want it to sound very, very fluid. I want the motion as you listen to this to be very satisfying, but I also want it to sound like a single entity, just with several different parts. And that's what each of these individual bass sounds represent. They're all just little variations of just different basses here. So like this is a electric bass sound from Timmy Techno. This is a preset here. And then we got some other ones here. So like this is a bass sound, and a couple other things. But the technique here that I want you to look at is how there aren't really any gaps here. We move from this, so I'll just play like this pattern. Okay, and what you notice is that there are some contrasts for sure, but it sounds, the bass sounds are similar. They're not radically different. And I point to complextro music because my most recent video was on that, and in that video, I pointed at the importance of having very contrasting sounds, right? Where when you're trying to create this impact of having very complex music, you want some soft sounds, and then you transition to some very, very sharp, very hard sounds. Here we don't do that. The sounds are quite similar, but they're also different in their own right. And that's what gives it this fluid motion, is we have sounds that are similar but different. Yeah, and that's pretty much how all of the bass section here is worked up, other than, now this is very different from this bass section that we looked at earlier, the seamless bass. Other than that, I mean, there's a couple other things in this track, but for the most part, I think I've covered all the like primary techniques that I used to create some amorphous sounds. I may do another video continuing on this front. There are a couple things we didn't get to, but if you have questions, let me know. I'd be happy to go over some things a little bit more in depth. And I would finally encourage you to maybe take this approach in some of your projects, because it's a very fun way to break the formula, right? A really, really fun way to break the formula. And you take what you know and you kind of throw it into like a blender and chop it up like carrots, right? And you just make something new with it, like a new secret sauce or something like that. And that's basically what this entire track was, and I believe that's why I created it so quickly. It's because it was such a new approach, trying to create this sort of psychedelic type of music that's very dynamic, very moving. If you haven't yet listened to the full track, you're probably really confused, so go ahead and listen to that. It's in the link in the description. But otherwise, have a wonderful day, guys, and I'll see you next time.